The smell of garlic and oregano should have been comforting, familiar, like coming home. Instead, it made my chest tighten as I stood outside Romano's Italian kitchen, watching through the large front windows as families laughed over steaming plates of pasta. This wasn't just any restaurant. This was my father's place, the empire he'd built from nothing, and I hadn't stepped foot inside in 12 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled as I adjusted my blazer, the expensive fabric a stark contrast to the torn jeans and oversized hoodie I'd worn the last time I was here. Back then, I was 18, heartbroken and desperate. Now, at 30, I was CEO of my own marketing firm, but standing here felt like being that scared kid all over again. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd driven here in a car worth more than some people's houses, yet I felt smaller than I had in years. Through the window, I could see her, Victoria, my stepmother, gliding between tables in her signature black dress, that perfectly practiced smile plastered across her face as she charmed customers. Even from outside, I could see the way she commanded the room, the way servers jumped at her slightest gesture. She'd always been good at performing, at making people believe she was something she wasn't. The story really begins 15 years ago, when I was 15 and my world fell apart in the space of a single afternoon. I was Sophia Romano back then, Daddy's little girl, who spent every weekend helping in the restaurant kitchen, learning the family recipes that had been passed down for generations. My mother, Isabella, had been the heart of Romano's, her laughter filling the dining room as she greeted regulars by name and remembered their children's birthdays. Cancer took her from us in 6 brutal months. I watched my vibrant, passionate mother fade away, while my father, Marco, threw himself into work to avoid facing his grief. The restaurant became his refuge, but it became my prison. Every corner held memories of her. Every recipe felt incomplete without her biding hands, showing me how to fold the ravioli just right or how to know when the risotto was perfect by the sound it made against the spoon. Dad barely spoke in those first months after the funeral. He'd come home after midnight, smelling of kitchen grease and exhaustion, and disappear into his office with a glass of wine and stacks of receipts. I'd hear him sometimes, late at night, making phone calls in rapid Italian, his voice strained with worry. The restaurant was struggling. Mom had handled all the front-of-house operations, the customer relations, the scheduling, the charm that kept people coming back. Without her, Romano's was just another Italian restaurant in a city full of them. That's when Victoria entered our lives, like a perfectly timed stage entrance. She was everything my mother wasn't, polished where Mom had been warm, calculated where Mom had been spontaneous. Victoria had managed upscale restaurants in Manhattan before moving to our small Connecticut town, and she had ideas, lots of them. She swept into Romano's with her clipboard and her business plans and her promises to save everything Dad had built. I wanted to hate her immediately, but I couldn't. Not at first. She was kind to me, in her own distant way. She'd ask about school, compliment my outfits, even helped me with my college application essays. When she moved in 6 months after meeting Dad, she brought fresh flowers for Mom's picture and promised she wasn't trying to replace anyone, just hoping to add something new to our little family. The wedding was small, private, held in the restaurant's back garden on a rainy Thursday in October. I wore the navy dress Victoria had picked out for me and smiled when the photographer told me to, but something felt wrong. Dad looked happy for the first time since Mom died, but it was a different kind of happiness, muted somehow, like he was playing a role he thought he should play rather than feeling genuine joy. Victoria's son, Marcus, moved in a month later. He was 2 years older than me, already in college, studying business administration. He was polite but distant, treating our house like a temporary stopping point rather than a home. I tried to connect with him, the way I'd always imagined having an older brother might be, but Marcus had inherited his mother's calculated nature. Every conversation felt like a transaction, every interaction measured for maximum benefit. The changes at the restaurant started slowly. Victoria modernized the menu, updated the decor, implemented new systems for inventory and scheduling. Dad seemed relieved to have someone else handling the business side of things, and I had to admit, the changes were working. Revenue was up, reviews were better, and Romano's was busier than it had been in years. But something was being lost in all that efficiency. The warmth that Mom had cultivated, the sense of family that had made Romano's special, was disappearing. Victoria smiled at customers, but it never reached her eyes. She remembered their orders, but not their stories. The restaurant was more successful than ever, but it felt like a beautiful, empty shell. I was 17 when I started noticing the subtle ways Victoria was erasing my mother's memory from Romano's. Mom's favorite painting, a vibrant landscape of the Italian countryside that had hung behind the bar for years, disappeared one day. Victoria said it didn't match the new aesthetic. The recipe cards written in Mom's careful handwriting were replaced with typed versions, more professional but somehow lifeless. Even the playlist that Mom had curated, full of classic Italian love songs and American jazz standards, was swapped out for generic background music that Victoria said was more sophisticated. Each change felt like a small death, but when I mentioned it to Dad, he'd just sigh and say that Victoria knew what she was doing, that we needed to trust her business expertise. He seemed afraid to disagree with her about anything related to the restaurant, as if challenging her might cause her to leave and take all her improvements with her. High school became my escape. I threw myself into my studies, joined the debate team, wrote for the school newspaper. Anything to avoid spending time at home, where Victoria's presence seemed to expand daily, filling every corner with her particular brand of cold efficiency. I had college applications to worry about, dreams of studying journalism at Northwestern or Columbia, plans that would take me far away from the suffocating atmosphere that Romano's had become. The summer before my senior year, Victoria suggested I work at the restaurant full-time, learning the business from the ground up. It sounded reasonable, even generous, but I knew better. She wanted me where she could see me, where she could control what I learned about the family business. I spent that summer bussing tables, taking orders, and watching Victoria operate. She was brilliant. I had to give her that. She knew exactly which customers to charm, which suppliers to pressure for better deals, which employees to promote, and which to quietly push out. But I also saw the way she manipulated situations to her advantage, the way she'd present her ideas to Dad as if they'd come from him, the way she'd casually mention how much better things were running now compared to before she arrived. Marcus graduated that year and immediately started working at Romano's in a management role, despite having no real restaurant experience beyond his business degree. Victoria created a position for him, assistant general manager, with a salary that I knew was higher than what some of the longtime servers were making. Dad went along with it, saying it was good to keep the business in the family, but I could see the resentment in the eyes of employees who'd been there for years. My 18th birthday fell on a Saturday in March, right in the middle of the dinner rush. I'd been looking forward to it for months, not because of any party or celebration, but because it meant I was officially an adult, one step closer to leaving for college in the fall. Dad had promised we'd have a quiet family dinner after the restaurant closed, just the four of us, maybe even break out one of the special bottles of wine he kept in the back office. Instead, I spent the evening serving tables while Victoria trained a new hostess and Marcus shadowed Dad in the kitchen. Nobody mentioned my birthday until closing time, when Victoria emerged from the office with a small wrapped box and an apologetic smile. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I'm sorry we got so busy tonight. You know how it is." The gift was a delicate gold bracelet, beautiful and expensive and completely impersonal. The kind of jewelry you'd buy for someone you barely knew but felt obligated to acknowledge. I thanked her, slipped it onto my wrist, and helped with the closing duties, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in my chest. Dad offed me to my car that night, his face heavy with exhaustion and what might have been guilt. "I'm sorry about tonight, Sophia. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your birthday." I wanted to tell him it wasn't about the birthday. It was about everything. About how I felt like a stranger in my own family, about how Mom's memory was being systematically erased, about how I could see Victoria positioning Marcus to inherit something that should have been mine by birthright. Instead, I just hugged him and said it was fine, because what else could I say? The real conversation came 3 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the restaurant was closed and Victoria was out running errands. Dad called me into his office, the same cramped space where he'd handled Romano's business for 20 years, now organized with Victoria's efficient filing systems and color-coded charts. "I've been thinking about your future," he said without preamble, his hands folded carefully on the desk between us. "About college, about your plans." I felt my stomach drop, though I couldn't say why. "What about them?" "Victoria and I have been talking, and we think it might be better if you stayed local. Community college for a couple years, then maybe transfer to state. You could keep working here, learn the business properly. Romanos will need strong leadership in the future, and your family." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had already been accepted to Northwestern with a partial scholarship. I had plans, dreams, a future mapped out that extended far beyond the borders of our small town and the walls of Romano's. "Dad, I already got into Northwestern. You saw the acceptance letter. You said you were proud of me." His face was pained, but his voice remained steady. "I am proud of you, Sophia, but college is expensive, and the restaurant needs investment right now. Victoria has some ideas for expansion, maybe opening a second location. We need to be smart about where we put our money." I stared at him, understanding dawning slowly and painfully. "You're not going to help me pay for college?" "I didn't say that, but maybe we can find a more affordable option, something that keeps you close to home, close to the family business." Family business? The phrase felt hollow when I knew that Victoria and Marcus were being positioned as the real inheritors of Romano's legacy. I was family in name only, useful for washing dishes and serving tables, but not important enough to invest in properly. The argument that followed was the worst fight my father and I had ever had. I accused him of choosing Victoria over me, of forgetting everything Mom had wanted for my future. He accused me of being ungrateful, of not understanding the sacrifices he'd made to keep Romano's running after Mom died. We both said things we couldn't take back, words that created a rift between us that felt impossible to bridge. Victoria returned home in the middle of our shouting match, and I'll never forget the look on her face. Not surprise, not concern, but something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if this was exactly what she'd been waiting for. "Maybe Sophia needs some time to think about what's really important," she said, in that calm, reasonable voice that made my anger feel petty and childish. "Family should come first, shouldn't it?" I looked at my father, waiting for him to defend me, to stand up for the dreams he'd encouraged just months earlier. Instead, he just looked tired and defeated, and I realized that Victoria had already won this battle long before I knew it was being fought. That night, I called my guidance counselor at home, desperate and crying. Mrs. Patterson had helped dozens of students navigate college applications and financial aid, and she listened patiently as I explained the situation. By the time I hung up, I had a plan. It wasn't the plan I wanted, but it was a path forward. I could defer Northwestern for a year, work full-time to save money, and apply for additional scholarships and financial aid. I could take out student loans to cover what I couldn't pay up front. It would mean graduating later than my classmates, starting my adult life with debt, but it was possible. I could still have the future I wanted, just with a longer, harder road to get there. The next morning, I told Dad about my decision over breakfast. Victoria was there too, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone with that same satisfied expression. Dad's relief was visible, as if I'd lifted a burden from his shoulders by choosing not to burden him with my education. "That's very mature of you, Sophia," Victoria said without looking up from her phone. "Sometimes we have to make sacrifices for the greater good." I spent the rest of my senior year working at Romano's every day after school and all weekend, saving every penny I could while watching Victoria and Marcus solidify their control over the restaurant. They instituted new policies without consulting Dad, hired their own people for key positions, and slowly pushed out longtime employees who they deemed inefficient or resistant to change. Mrs. Chen, who had been Mom's closest friend and had worked as head server for 15 years, was let go for allegedly poor customer service. Tony, the line cook who had taught me how to make perfect risotto, was replaced by someone younger and cheaper. Each departure felt like another piece of Mom's Romano's disappearing forever. Graduation came and went with minimal fanfare. Dad and Victoria attended the ceremony, took the obligatory photos, and gave me a card with a modest check inside. That night, while my classmates were at parties celebrating the end of high school, I was at Romano's, serving dinner to families and couples who had no idea they were eating in a restaurant that was slowly being stripped of everything that had once made it special. Summer stretched ahead of me like a prison sentence. I had managed to save nearly $8,000, not nearly enough for a full year at Northwestern, but a decent start. I had reapplied for financial aid, written scholarship essays until my fingers cramped, and even taken on additional shifts at a local coffee shop to maximize my earning potential. But the more money I saved, the more I could see Victoria's resentment growing. She made subtle comments about my work ethic, suggested that maybe I wasn't as committed to the family business as I claimed to be. She'd assign me the worst shifts, the most difficult customers, the messiest cleanup duties. Nothing I could complain about directly, but a steady campaign of small humiliations designed to make me understand my place in the hierarchy. Marcus, meanwhile, was being groomed for leadership with increasing obviousness. Dad would take him to supplier meetings, include him in menu planning discussions, and talk openly about his ideas for Romano's future. When customers complimented the food, Victoria would make sure they knew that Marcus was learning the business from the ground up, preparing to carry on the family tradition. The breaking point came in late July, on one of the hottest days of the summer. The air conditioning in the restaurant was struggling, the kitchen was brutal, and we were short-staffed because Victoria had refused to approve overtime for additional servers. I had been on my feet for 10 hours straight, covering for a sick coworker while also handling my regular duties. Near the end of the night, I was clearing a table when I overheard Victoria talking to a customer at the bar, an older man who was apparently a food critic from a local magazine. She was telling him about Romano's history, about how the restaurant had been struggling before she arrived and brought it back to life with her vision and expertise. The previous management was very old-fashioned, she was saying, her voice carrying that tone of gentle condescension I knew so well. I dropped the plates I was carrying. The crash echoed through the dining room like a gunshot, and every conversation stopped as dozens of eyes turned toward me. Victoria's face went white, then red, as she realized I had heard everything. "Sophia," Dad's voice cut through the silence as he emerged from the kitchen. "What happened?" I looked at him, then at Victoria, then at the mess of broken ceramic at my feet, and something inside me just snapped. All the months of swallowing my anger, of accepting Victoria's subtle cruelties, of watching my mother's legacy be systematically erased, came boiling to the surface. "I'm done," I said, my voice surprisingly calm despite the rage coursing through me. "I'm done pretending this is still my family's restaurant. I'm done watching you erase everything Mom built, and I'm done listening to you lie about our history to make yourself look better." The silence was deafening. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and Dad looked stricken, his face pale with shock and embarrassment. "Sophia, you're overwrought," Victoria said finally, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Perhaps you should go home and rest. We'll discuss this tomorrow when you've calmed down." "No," I said, untying my apron and dropping it on top of the broken plates. "We won't, because I won't be here tomorrow, or the day after that, or ever again." I walked out of Romano's that night with my head held high and my heart breaking into pieces. The parking lot was empty except for my old Honda Civic, and I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, crying and shaking and trying to process what I had just done. Dad followed me outside eventually, his face haggard in the parking lot lights. He tapped on my window, and I rolled it down, hoping against hope that he would apologize, that he would tell me Victoria was wrong and I was right, and we could find a way to fix this. Instead, he just looked tired and disappointed. "That was inappropriate, Sophia. Victoria is my wife, and she's been good for this family and this business. You owe her an apology." I stared at him, this man who had raised me, who had once called me his little princess and promised me the world, and realized that I didn't recognize him anymore. Victoria hadn't just changed Romanos, she had changed him too, turned him into someone who would choose her comfort over his daughter's dignity. "No, Dad," I said quietly, "I don't owe her anything, but you owe Mom better than this." I drove away that night without looking back, but I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot like a lost man trying to remember where he belonged. The next few weeks were a blur of job applications, apartment hunting, and frantic phone calls to Northwestern's financial aid office. I managed to find a tiny studio apartment above a used bookstore, got a job waiting tables at a diner across town, and pieced together enough loans and grants to make my college dream barely possible. I left for Northwestern in August with 2 suitcases, $1,000 in my checking account, and a deep ache in my chest that I thought might be permanent. Dad never called to say goodbye, never wished me luck, never acknowledged that I was leaving. Victoria had gotten what she wanted, complete control over Romano's, and no inconvenient stepdaughter to complicate her plans. College was everything I had hoped it would be and nothing like I had expected. The academic challenges were exhilarating, but the financial pressure was constant and crushing. I worked 3 part-time jobs, lived on ramen noodles and determination, and spent most nights in the library because my tiny dorm room felt too expensive to waste time in. But I survived. More than survived. I thrived. I discovered I had a talent for understanding people, for seeing the stories behind their public faces, for connecting with audiences in ways that felt natural and authentic. My journalism professors encouraged me to consider marketing and public relations, fields where my skills could translate into financial stability. By junior year, I had changed my major to marketing and communications, landed an internship at a prestigious Chicago firm, and started to believe that maybe I could build something meaningful from the ashes of my old life. I was still angry, still hurt, but I was also becoming someone new, someone stronger than the girl who had cried in the parking lot of Romano's all those years ago. I graduated summa cum laude with job offers from 3 different firms and a starting salary that seemed impossible after years of counting every penny. I chose Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized agency that specialized in rebranding struggling businesses, partly because the work appealed to me and partly because there was a delicious irony in helping other people save their family legacies. The years that followed were a whirlwind of success that sometimes felt surreal. I was good at my job, really good, with an intuitive understanding of how to help businesses tell their stories in ways that resonated with customers. I worked with family restaurants, boutique hotels, local retailers, all kinds of enterprises that were struggling to find their voice in an increasingly crowded marketplace. Each success felt like a small victory over Victoria's voice in my head, the one that whispered I wasn't good enough, wasn't smart enough, wasn't worth investing in. I was promoted twice in my first 3 years, bought my own condo in downtown Chicago, and started to feel like I was finally building the life I had always dreamed of. By the time I was 28, I was ready to take the leap into entrepreneurship. I had saved enough money to survive the lean early months, had built a network of contacts and potential clients, and had developed a reputation in the industry that preceded me into meetings. Romano Marketing Solutions felt like the right name for my new venture, a way of reclaiming my family legacy on my own terms. The irony of helping other people save their family businesses while being estranged from my own wasn't lost on me. But every restaurant owner who thanked me for helping them reconnect with their community, every small business that found new life through better storytelling felt like a step toward healing something that had been broken inside me for years. My firm grew faster than I had dared to hope. Within 2 years, I had 12 employees and a client list that included some of the most respected family-owned businesses in the Midwest. We specialized in authentic storytelling, in helping businesses remember what made them special before they lost their way in pursuit of generic success. It was deeply satisfying work, but it was also a constant reminder of what I had lost. Every family restaurant we worked with, every multi-generational business struggling to pass the torch to the next generation, made me think of Romano's and wonder what it might have become if things had been different. I tried not to think about Dad, but sometimes I would catch myself searching for news about Romano's online, looking for reviews or social media posts that might give me a glimpse into what the restaurant had become. The pictures I found showed a sleek, modern establishment that barely resembled the warm, chaotic place I remembered from my childhood. It looked successful, but soulless, like a beautiful corpse. Then, last month, everything changed with a single phone call. I was in my office reviewing proposals for a new client when my assistant buzzed in to tell me that Marco Romano was online too, asking to speak with me about a business matter. I stared at the phone for a full minute before picking it up, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he would be able to hear it through the receiver. "Hello, Dad." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Sophia." He sounded older, tired, uncertain. I wasn't sure you would take my call. I almost didn't." There was a long pause, filled with 12 years of silence and hurt and missed opportunities. Finally, he cleared his throat and continued. "I'm calling because I need help. Romano's is in trouble, real trouble, and I think you might be the only person who can save it." The story he told me over the next hour was both shocking and utterly predictable. Victoria's ambitious expansion plans had failed spectacularly. The second location had hemorrhaged money for 2 years before closing. The renovations to the original restaurant had cost 3 times the projected budget. Marcus had proven to be a disaster as a manager, alienating longtime customers with his arrogant attitude and driving away experienced staff with his incompetence. But the real crisis was deeper than financial mismanagement. Romano's had lost its soul, its connection to the community that had sustained it for decades. Customer reviews complained about poor service, indifferent food, and a cold atmosphere that felt more like a corporate chain than a family restaurant. Revenue was down 60% from its peak, and they were 3 months behind on rent. "Victoria left," Dad said quietly, the words heavy with defeat and perhaps relief. "Took Marcus with her. Said she wasn't going to watch everything she'd built fall apart because I couldn't make the hard decisions necessary to save it." The bitter irony was that Victoria's abandonment of Romano's was exactly what the restaurant needed to have a chance at survival. But Dad was 68 years old, exhausted by years of conflict and failure, and had no idea how to rebuild what had been lost. "I know I don't deserve to ask this of you," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I failed you, failed your mother's memory, failed everything that mattered. But Romano's was your mother's dream too, and I can't bear to watch it die without trying everything to save it." I closed my eyes and tried to process the flood of emotions his words had unleashed. Anger at his abandonment 12 years ago, satisfaction that Victoria's schemes had finally collapsed, grief for the relationship we might have had if he had chosen differently, and underneath it all, a deep, aching love for the man who had taught me to cook, who had carried me on his shoulders through the restaurant when I was small, who had once promised me that Romano's would be mine someday. "I can't do this as your daughter," I said finally. "Too much has happened. Too much damage has been done. But I might be able to help as a business consultant, if you're serious about making real changes."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Whatever it takes," he said immediately. "I'll pay your firm's standard rates. I'll sign any contract you want. I need help, Sophia. I need someone who understands what Romano's used to be and what it could be again." We arranged to meet the following week at Romano's after hours, when we could talk privately about what it would take to save the restaurant. I spent the days leading up to that meeting researching everything I could about Romano's current situation, analyzing their social media presence, reading every online review, studying their financial records that Dad had reluctantly agreed to share. The picture that emerged was even worse than he had described. Romano's wasn't just struggling, it was dying a slow, painful death that was visible to anyone who cared to look. But buried underneath all the damage, I could still see traces of the restaurant Mom had built, the warmth and authenticity that had made it special. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was still something worth saving. Which brings me back to tonight, standing outside Romano's with my heart pounding and my hands shaking, trying to find the courage to walk through those doors and face the ghosts of my past. Dad is expecting me in an hour, but I wanted to see the restaurant first as a customer might see it, to understand what we were really dealing with. The dining room looked elegant but sterile, full of expensive furniture that belonged in a hotel lobby rather than a family restaurant. The walls that had once been covered with photos of satisfied customers and family memories now displayed generic Italian landscapes and mass-produced artwork. Even the music was wrong, some bland contemporary jazz that had no connection to the passionate, joyful atmosphere Mom had cultivated. But it was seeing Victoria through that window, still playing the role of gracious hostess as if nothing had changed, that made me realize Dad hadn't told me the whole truth about her departure. She might have moved out of his house and given up her formal role in the restaurant, but she was clearly still here, still trying to control Romano's destiny. This was going to be even more complicated than I had anticipated. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked toward the front door of Romano's Italian kitchen, ready to face whatever waited for me inside. After 12 years of exile, I was coming home, not as the heartbroken teenager who had fled in anger and pain, but as a successful businesswoman with the power to save or destroy everything my family had built. The question was, what did I really want to do with that power? The hostess at the front desk looked up with a practiced smile as I approached, her eyes quickly scanning my outfit in that way service workers do when they're trying to assess how much attention a customer deserves. My tailored blazer and expensive handbag apparently passed her test because her smile brightened considerably. "Good evening. Welcome to Romano's. Do you have a reservation?" Before I could answer, a familiar voice cut through the ambient dinner conversation like a knife through butter. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight. You'll need to make a reservation for another evening." Victoria appeared beside the hostess stand as if she'd materialized from thin air, her black dress as perfectly pressed as ever, her smile as sharp and cold as I remembered. She looked exactly the same as she had 12 years ago, as if she'd been preserved in amber while the rest of the world moved forward. The hostess looked confused, glancing between us with obvious uncertainty. The dining room was maybe 60% full, clearly not at capacity, and several empty tables were visible from where we stood. But Victoria's authority was absolute here, just as it had always been. "Mrs. Romano, I thought we had space available," the young woman ventured carefully. "Not for everyone," Victoria replied, her eyes never leaving mine. "Some people simply don't belong here anymore." The recognition hit me like a physical blow to the chest. After 12 years, she knew me instantly, and the venom in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the polite dismissal she might give to an undesirable customer. This was personal, intimate, designed to cut as deeply as possible. "Hello, Victoria," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "You look well. Abandoning sinking ships clearly agrees with you." Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush that crept up her neck at my words. The hostess took a small step backward, sensing the tension crackling between us like electricity before a thunderstorm. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Victoria said smoothly, but her fingers tightened on the leather reservation book she was holding. "As I said, we're fully booked. Perhaps you could try the Olive Garden down the street. I'm sure they'd be more suitable for your tastes." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to remind me of my place in her hierarchy. The implication was clear. I didn't belong in the sophisticated establishment she had created, regardless of how successful I might have become in the years since our last encounter. I felt the familiar surge of anger that Victoria had always been able to provoke in me, but this time it was tempered by something else. Amusement, maybe? Or pity. Here she was, still playing the same petty games, still trying to maintain control over a restaurant that was hemorrhaging money and customers, still pretending she held all the cards, when everything around her was crumbling. "Actually, I'm here on business," I said, pulling my phone from my purse and making a show of checking the time. "I have a meeting with Marco Romano in about 45 minutes, something about consulting work." The blood drained from Victoria's face so quickly I thought she might faint. The hostess looked even more confused, clearly unsure whose authority she should follow in this increasingly awkward situation. "That's impossible," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Marco doesn't make business decisions without consulting me first. He would never hire an outside consultant, especially not someone who—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but we both knew what she had been about to say. Especially not someone who had walked out on the family, who had caused such a scene. who had rejected everything they had tried to build together. "Times change," I said simply. "People grow up. Businesses evolve. Sometimes what worked in the past stops working, and you have to try new approaches." I could see the wheels turning behind Victoria's eyes as she processed this information. If I was telling the truth about the business meeting, it meant Dad had reached out to me directly, without her knowledge or approval. It meant he had acknowledged that Romano's needed help that she and Marcus had been unable or unwilling to provide. Most importantly, it meant her control over the situation was not as absolute as she had believed. "I'll need to verify this with Marco before seating you," she said finally, reaching for the phone behind the hostess stand. "Of course," I replied, "though I should mention that he's expecting me to observe the restaurant's operations before our meeting. Get a sense of the current customer experience, staff efficiency, that sort of thing. Standard procedure for this type of consultation." It was a complete lie, but Victoria didn't know that. I watched as she weighed her options, trying to calculate the risks of each possible course of action. If she refused to seat me, and I really did have a meeting with Dad, she would look obstructive and unreasonable. If she accommodated me, and I was lying, she would have wasted a table and her dignity. The phone rang 4 times before Dad's voice came through, sounding tired and distracted. "Romano's? Marco speaking."
Marco, it's Victoria. There's a woman here claiming to have a business meeting with you tonight. She says she's a consultant. There was a pause that seemed to stretch on forever. I could hear kitchen noise in the background, the clatter of plates, and the rapid-fire Italian that always accompanied the dinner rush. Finally, Dad's voice came back, quieter now, more careful. "What does she look like?" Victoria's eyes met mine across the hostess stand, and I saw something flicker in her expression. Fear, maybe, or the first hint of understanding that the world had shifted beneath her feet while she wasn't paying attention. Tall, dark hair, expensive clothes, professional looking. Victoria paused, as if the next words were difficult to say. "She looks familiar." Another long silence. When Dad spoke again, his voice was heavy with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Relief, perhaps, mixed with apprehension, and something that might have been hope. "Seat her at table 12, the one by the kitchen window. And Victoria, leave her alone. This conversation has been a long time coming." The phone went dead, leaving Victoria staring at the receiver as if it had personally betrayed her. The hostess looked between us uncertainly, waiting for direction from someone who suddenly seemed much less sure of her authority. "This way, please," the young woman said finally, grabbing a menu and leading me toward the back of the dining room. Table 12 was indeed by the kitchen window, offering a clear view of the controlled chaos that defined any restaurant's heart during the dinner rush. It was also, I realized, the same table where Mom used to sit when she took breaks between greeting customers, the spot where she could keep an eye on both the dining room and the kitchen while catching her breath. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Dad had placed me in Mom's chair, in the position where she had once overseen everything that made Romano special. Whether it was intentional or unconscious, it felt like a message, a recognition of something that had been lost when I left all those years ago. I ordered a glass of the Chianti that I remembered being Mom's favorite and settled in to observe Victoria's version of Romano's Italian kitchen. What I saw was a masterclass in everything that could go wrong when efficiency replaced passion, when systems supplanted soul. The servers moved through their routines with mechanical precision, but there was no warmth in their interactions with customers, no genuine connection. They took orders, delivered food, processed payments, and moved on to the next table without ever truly engaging with the people they were serving. It was competent, but cold, professional, but lifeless. The food, when it arrived at neighboring tables, looked beautiful. Victoria had clearly invested in presentation, and every plate was arranged with Instagram-worthy precision. But I watched faces as people tasted their meals, saw the slight disappointment in their expressions, the polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. The food looked like Italian cuisine, but it didn't taste like Romano's. Most telling of all was the atmosphere. The dining room was quiet in a way that felt wrong for an Italian restaurant. Conversations were muted, laughter was rare, and there was none of the boisterous joy that had once characterized Romano's during busy evenings. People ate their meals and left, but they didn't linger, didn't savor the experience, didn't create the memories that turn customers into regulars. Victoria made several passes through the dining room during my hour of observation, each time making a point of checking on tables near mine, clearly hoping to overhear something useful about my presence or my intentions. But I had learned patience during my years in business, and I simply sipped my wine and took mental notes about everything I was witnessing. The wine itself told a story. It was a perfectly respectable Chianti, probably costing 3 times what Dad used to pay for the house wine. But it lacked the character of the bottles Mom had personally selected from small vineyards during their trips to Italy. Like everything else in the new Romanos, it was expensive but generic, impressive, forgettable. 20 minutes before my scheduled meeting, I saw Dad emerge from the kitchen, scanning the dining room until his eyes found mine. The years had been unkind to him. His hair was completely gray now, his face deeply lined with worry and exhaustion. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of whatever struggles he had endured in the years since we last spoke. He approached my table slowly, as if he weren't sure of his welcome, and I felt a stab of sympathy despite everything that had happened between us. This was still my father, the man who had taught me to tie my shoes and helped me with my homework and held me while I cried after Mom died. "You came," he said simply, sliding into the chair across from me. "You asked for help," I replied. Despite everything, I couldn't ignore that. We sat in awkward silence for a moment, two people who had once been closer than anything, trying to navigate the chasm that 12 years of hurt and misunderstanding had created between us. "You look good," Dad said finally. "Successful. I've been following your company online, reading articles about your work. I'm proud of what you've built." The words hit me harder than I had expected. How long had I waited to hear him say that? How many nights had I lain awake wondering if he ever thought about me, ever regretted the choices that had driven us apart? "It wasn't easy," I said. "Building something from nothing never is." He winced at the implied criticism, but didn't defend himself. Instead, he gestured around the dining room with a bitter smile. "This isn't nothing, but it feels like it sometimes. Victoria always said I was too sentimental, too attached to the old ways. She said Romanos needed to modernize or die. I thought she was right. I thought she knew better than I did about running a business." And now? Dad's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his mistakes was physically crushing him. Now I know the difference between running a business and running a restaurant. Victoria could run a business, any business, but she never understood that Romano's wasn't just about profit margins and efficiency ratings. It was about family, about community, about making people feel like they belonged somewhere special. I looked around the sterile dining room, thinking about the vibrant, chaotic, joyful place it had been when Mom was alive. "When did you realize she was wrong?" "Too late," he said quietly. "Much too late. The customers started complaining first, said the food didn't taste the same, that the service felt rushed and impersonal. I told myself they just needed time to adjust to the improvements. Then the regular customers stopped coming. Families who had been eating here for 20 years suddenly found other places to celebrate their anniversaries and birthdays." He paused, running his hands through his gray hair in a gesture that reminded me painfully of the man I had once looked up to as a hero. The Maruttis were the last straw.
"You remember them? They'd been coming here every Friday night since before you were born. Maria always ordered the same thing, chicken parmigiana with extra cheese, and Giuseppe would try something different every time, but always complained it wasn't as good as what his mother made." I did remember them. They had been like grandparents to me, always asking about school and bringing me little gifts on holidays. Mom had baked a special cake for their 50th wedding anniversary, and the whole restaurant had sung to them while they cried happy tears. What happened to them? Marcus happened. They came in one Friday night. Their usual table wasn't available because Victoria had implemented a new reservation system. Marcus told them they could wait at the bar or come back another night. Can you imagine? Giuseppe Moretti, who fought in Korea and built half the houses in this town with his own hands, being told to wait at the bar like some kid trying to get into a nightclub? Dad's voice was thick with shame and regret. Maria started crying, not making a scene, just quiet tears running down her cheeks. And instead of apologizing, instead of making it right, Marcus told them that if they couldn't handle the new policies, maybe Romano's wasn't the right place for them anymore. The casual cruelty of it made my stomach turn. This was what Victoria had created, what she had taught Marcus to value. Efficiency over empathy, policy over people, profit over the relationships that made a family restaurant more than just another place to eat. They never came back, Dad continued. 50 years of Friday night dinners, and they never came back. That's when I started to understand what we'd lost, what I'd let Victoria take away from us. But you didn't stop her? No, the word came out like a confession. I didn't stop her. I was tired, Sophia. Tired of fighting, tired of worrying about money, tired of trying to hold everything together after your mother died. Victoria made it all seem easier. She handled the problems, made the decisions, took the responsibility off my shoulders. I told myself I was being smart, delegating to someone who understood modern business. I wanted to be angry with him, to unleash 12 years of accumulated hurt and resentment. But looking at this broken, defeated man across from me, I found I couldn't summon the rage I had carried for so long. He wasn't the villain of this story, just another victim of Victoria's manipulation. When did she leave? I asked. 3 months ago. The bank was threatening foreclosure, suppliers were demanding payment, and the staff was down to a skeleton crew because we couldn't make payroll consistently. Victoria called it a family meeting, sat Marcus and me down, and explained that she had done everything she could to save Romano's, but I was too stubborn to implement the necessary changes. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painful. Victoria, who had systematically destroyed everything that made Romano special, blaming Dad for being unwilling to change. She said she wouldn't watch her hard work be destroyed by my nostalgia and poor business sense. She and Marcus had been offered positions at a restaurant group in Boston, managing multiple locations. Better opportunity, she said. More professional environment. And they just left? Packed up over a weekend, took their personal belongings, emptied the joint bank account, and disappeared. Left me with a note explaining that they hoped I would come to my senses and call them when I was ready to run Romano's like a real business instead of a nostalgic shrine to the past.
Profitable? I pulled out my phone and opened the Notes app where I had been tracking Romano's online reviews and social media presence. Because the numbers I'm seeing tell a different story. Revenue down 60% from peak, customer satisfaction ratings in freefall, staff turnover at nearly 100% annually. That doesn't sound like success to me. Victoria's face flushed with anger. Those are temporary setbacks, growing pains from implementing necessary changes. The customers who complained were stuck in the past, unwilling to appreciate improvements. The staff who left were resistant to professional standards. Any successful transformation requires some short-term sacrifice for long-term gain. And the long-term gain was supposed to be what exactly? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you transformed a beloved community institution into a generic, overpriced restaurant that nobody wants to visit. You have no idea what you're talking about, Victoria snapped, her careful composure finally cracking. You ran away when you were barely an adult, abandoned your family when they needed you most, and now you waltz back in here after 12 years thinking you can judge decisions you weren't here to make? The accusation stung because there was just enough truth in it to make me doubt myself. Had I abandoned my family? Should I have stayed and fought harder for Romano's, for the memory of what Mom had built? But then I looked around the sterile dining room, heard the mechanical conversations between servers and customers, tasted the expensive but flavorless wine in my glass, and knew that my leaving hadn't caused this destruction. Victoria had done this systematically, deliberately, turning Romano's into something that looked successful on paper but had no soul. "I left because you made it clear I wasn't welcome here," I said quietly. "You and Dad chose efficiency over family, profit over relationships, Marcus's future over mine. I didn't abandon anyone. I was pushed out." "You were offered a place here." Victoria's voice rose enough to attract attention from nearby tables. "We tried to include you in the family business, to give you a role in Romano's future. But you were too stubborn, too attached to your dead mother's outdated ideas to accept the changes that needed to be made." "The changes that needed to be made?" I stood up, my own composure beginning to fray. "You mean like firing Mrs. Chen after 15 years of loyal service? Like replacing Tony's handmade pasta with frozen suppliers? Like removing every trace of my mother's personality from the restaurant she built with her own hands?" "Your mother was lovely, but she wasn't a businesswoman," Victoria said, rising to face me across the small table. "Sentiment doesn't pay the bills, Sophia. Customer loyalty doesn't guarantee profit margins. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions to survive in a competitive market." "And how did those hard decisions work out for you?" I asked. "Because last I heard, you were 3 months behind on rent and facing foreclosure. Doesn't sound like your business expertise was quite as valuable as you thought." Victoria's face went white with rage. "You think you can save this place? You think your fancy marketing degree and your boutique consulting firm make you qualified to run a restaurant? You're just a little girl playing dress-up in expensive clothes, pretending to be something you're not." The words were designed to cut deep, to reduce me to the insecure teenager she remembered. But 12 years of building my own success had given me armor against her particular brand of psychological warfare. "Maybe I am pretending," I said calmly, "but at least I'm pretending to be someone who cares about more than just profit margins. At least I remember what Romano's used to mean to this community before you turned it into a monument to your own ego." "Ladies." Dad's voice cut through our argument like a knife. He had returned from the kitchen while we were fighting and was standing beside our table with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This is neither the time nor the place for this conversation." Victoria immediately shifted tactics, her anger transforming into wounded dignity. "Marco, I was just trying to understand why you felt it necessary to hire an outside consultant without discussing it with me first, especially someone with such obvious bias against the improvements we've made here." "We're not married anymore, Victoria," Dad said quietly. "I don't need to discuss my business decisions with you." The words hit her like a physical blow. For all her talk of moving on to better opportunities, for all her claims of being done with Romano's, she had clearly expected to maintain some level of control over Dad and the restaurant. His quiet assertion of independence was perhaps the first time in years that he had stood up to her. "I see." Victoria's voice was ice cold. "Well then, I suppose there's nothing more for me to discuss. But Marco, remember that this restaurant's current problems started long before I left. Don't let nostalgia and misplaced loyalty to the real causes of Romano's decline." She gathered her purse and walked away without another word, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. Several customers watched her exit with obvious curiosity, and I realized our argument had provided more entertainment than most of them had expected from their dinner out. Dad slumped back into his chair, looking exhausted by the confrontation. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Victoria has been difficult since she moved out. She keeps coming around, offering advice, making suggestions about how to fix things. I think she expected me to beg her to come back." "And you?" "No." The word was quiet but firm. "Whatever mistakes I made, whatever wrong turns I took, I know now that Victoria wasn't the answer. She never understood what made Romano special. She only saw inefficiencies to be corrected, traditions to be updated, sentiment to be eliminated." I sat back down, my adrenaline still running high from the confrontation, but my mind already shifting into professional mode. This was what I did, after all.
I helped struggling businesses remember who they were and figure out how to become that again in a modern marketplace. Tell me about the current state of the business, I said. Not the emotional stuff, not the regrets about the past, just the numbers. What are we really dealing with here? Dad pulled a folder from under his arm, the kind of detailed financial analysis that I suspected Victoria had trained him to prepare for business meetings. The irony that he was using her systems to plan her replacement wasn't lost on either of us. The numbers were worse than he had described on the phone. Romano's was losing money every month, burning through what remained of their credit line to cover basic operating expenses.
Staff turnover was astronomical, customer complaints were increasing, and online reviews painted a picture of a restaurant that had lost its way completely. But buried in all the bad news were glimmers of hope. The food costs weren't unreasonable, the location was still prime real estate, and the Romano's name still carried weight in the community despite recent problems. Most importantly, there were customers who remembered what the restaurant used to be and would be willing to give it another chance if they believed it could recapture its former magic. This is salvageable, I said finally, looking up from the financial reports. Difficult, expensive, requiring some major changes, but salvageable. The question is whether you're really ready to do what it takes to save it. What do you mean? I set the folder aside and leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. I mean, admitting that almost everything Victoria implemented needs to be undone. I mean, hiring back the staff she drove away, if they're willing to return. I mean, going back to handmade pasta and locally sourced ingredients and wine selections based on taste rather than profit margins. I mean, rebuilding relationships with customers who feel betrayed and abandoned. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing what I was telling him. That sounds like starting over. In some ways, it is, but we wouldn't be starting from nothing. We'd be starting from Mom's foundation, from the reputation and goodwill she built over decades of treating customers like family and creating food that came from the heart. And you'd be willing to help with that, despite everything that happened between us? I had been asking myself the same question since his phone call, and I still wasn't entirely sure of the answer. Working with Dad would mean confronting painful memories, risking old wounds being reopened, potentially putting my own business reputation on the line if Romanos couldn't be saved. But it would also mean the chance to honor Mom's legacy, to restore something beautiful that had been damaged, to heal relationships that had been broken by misunderstanding and manipulation. And maybe, just maybe, to find my way back to the family I had lost 12 years ago. I'd be willing to try, I said carefully, but it would have to be a real partnership, not you hiring me to rubber stamp decisions you've already made. And it would have to be about rebuilding Romano's as Mom envisioned it, not as some compromise between her values and Victoria's business philosophy. What would that look like, practically speaking? I pulled out my laptop and opened a new document, my mind already racing with possibilities. It would start with an honest assessment of what we're working with: current staff, existing suppliers, equipment condition, customer base analysis. Then we'd develop a plan for transitioning back to Romano's original identity while addressing the legitimate business concerns that Victoria was trying to solve. You think that's possible? Having the heart of the old Romanos but with modern business practices? I know it is, I said with more confidence than I felt. That's what my firm does. We help family businesses find ways to honor their traditions while adapting to contemporary markets. It's not easy, but it's definitely possible. Dad nodded slowly, and I could see hope beginning to replace the desperation in his eyes. When would you want to start? I've already started, I admitted. I spent the last hour observing your current operations, and I have some ideas about immediate changes that could begin turning things around. But Dad, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we really commit to saving Romanos, Victoria is going to fight us every step of the way. She's not going to give up easily. I know, his voice was tired but determined. But I can't keep living with the regret of letting her destroy everything your mother built. If there's a chance to fix this, to make Romano's what it was supposed to be, then I have to take it. I looked around the dining room one more time, trying to see past Victoria's cold efficiency to the warm, welcoming place it could become again.
The bones were still good. The location was perfect. The names still meant something to people who remembered. "All right," I said, extending my hand across the table. "Partners?" Dad's smile was the first genuine expression I had seen from him all evening. Partners. As we shook hands, I caught a glimpse of movement near the front windows. Victoria was standing on the sidewalk outside, her phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating angrily as she spoke to whoever was on the other end. Even through the glass, I could see the fury on her face, the realization that her control over Romanos and over Dad was slipping away. She had underestimated me 12 years ago, dismissing me as a sentimental child who could be easily pushed aside. Now she was about to discover that the scared teenager she remembered had grown into someone much more dangerous, a successful businesswoman who understood exactly what Victoria had done and had the skills to undo it. The real battle for Romanos was just beginning. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray October drizzle that made everything look tired and defeated. I sat in my rental car outside Romano's at 7:30, watching Dad unlock the front door and flip on the lights that would eliminate another day of struggle. We had agreed to meet early, before the prep work began, to start implementing the first phase of our rescue plan. What I hadn't expected was to see Victoria's silver Mercedes already parked across the street, with Victoria herself sitting behind the wheel like a surveillance operative. She had been there when I arrived 20 minutes earlier, and she showed no signs of leaving. Whatever conversation she'd had on her phone the night before had clearly resulted in a new strategy. I grabbed my briefcase and headed for the restaurant's front door, ignoring Victoria's obvious stare. Dad looked up with relief as I entered, his face brightening with the kind of hope I hadn't seen from him in years. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come," he admitted, pouring coffee from the machine behind the counter. "Part of me thought you might wake up this morning and decide this was all too complicated, too risky." "I gave you my word," I replied, accepting the steaming mug gratefully. "Besides, I've been thinking about this all night, and I have some ideas that I think could work." Before I could elaborate, the front door chimed again, and Victoria swept into the restaurant with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She was dressed in a sharp business suit that screamed expensive lawyer, and she carried a leather portfolio that looked ominous in its official importance. "Good morning, Marco," she said pleasantly, as if her dramatic exit the previous evening had never happened. "I hope you don't mind my stopping by. There are some legal matters we need to discuss before you make any hasty decisions about consultants or business partnerships." Dad's face went pale. "What kind of legal matters?" Victoria smiled and opened her portfolio, withdrawing a thick stack of documents bound with blue backing. "Well, there's the matter of my investment in Romano's renovations and expansion, the loan I co-signed for the kitchen equipment upgrades, my contributions to the operational improvements that increased this restaurant's value significantly over the past several years." She spread the papers across the nearest table, like a dealer laying out cards. "According to my attorney, I have a substantial financial interest in this establishment that can't simply be ignored because our marriage has ended. Any major business decisions, including hiring consultants or changing operational procedures, require my written consent." I felt my stomach drop as I recognized what she was doing. Victoria had spent years positioning herself as an indispensable partner in Romano's success, and now she was calling in those carefully documented investments to maintain control, even after walking away. "You said you were done with this place," Dad said weakly. "You said you wanted nothing more to do with Romanos." "I said I was done watching you make poor decisions that threatened my investment," Victoria corrected smoothly. "But that doesn't mean I'm prepared to stand by while you destroy everything I've built here."
These documents clearly establish my legal right to protect my interests. I moved closer to examine the papers, my marketing background having taught me to read contracts and financial agreements with a skeptical eye. What I saw was indeed impressive in its thoroughness. Victoria had documented every improvement, every investment, every financial contribution with legal precision. She had loans, receipts, partnership agreements, and investment records that painted a picture of someone who had saved Romano's from bankruptcy through her own resources. But something felt wrong about the timeline. The dates on some of the documents didn't align with what I remembered about Romano's financial situation when Victoria first arrived. The amounts seemed inflated, and several of the improvement projects were listed as more expensive than I recalled them actually being.
These numbers seem high, I said carefully, picking up a receipt for kitchen renovations. $30,000 for new stoves and prep stations? I've worked with restaurant clients before, and that's about double what comparable equipment should cost. Victoria's smile tightened slightly. Quality equipment is expensive, as any professional would know. Perhaps your boutique consulting firm doesn't work with establishments that prioritize the best available tools. The insult was designed to put me on the defensive, but I had learned to recognize her manipulation techniques. Instead of responding to the bait, I continued examining the documents, looking for the inconsistencies that my instincts told me were there. "Dad, do you remember this equipment purchase?" I asked, showing him the inflated receipt. "Does $30,000 sound right for what was actually installed?" Dad squinted at the paperwork, his brow furrowing with confusion. "I don't know. Victoria handled all the vendor negotiations. She said she got us the best prices available, that the equipment would pay for itself in efficiency improvements." "And did you sign any documents establishing Victoria as a legal partner in Romano's?" I continued, shifting through the stack of agreements. There were so many papers: insurance documents, loan applications, vendor contracts. Victoria explained them all, said they were necessary for the business improvements. I trusted her judgment about the legal details. I could see what had happened. Victoria had buried partnership agreements and investment claims in stacks of legitimate business paperwork, presenting them as routine documents, while establishing her legal control over Romano's piece by piece. Dad, overwhelmed by grief and financial pressure, had signed whatever she put in front of him without fully understanding the implications. It was brilliant and completely ruthless. Even if her investment claims were inflated, even if the partnership agreements had been obtained through manipulation, they were still legally binding documents that would hold up in court. Victoria had effectively engineered a hostile takeover of Romano's while making it look like she was saving the business. "These documents are certainly comprehensive," I admitted, setting them back on the table. "But I'm curious about something. If you have such a substantial legal and financial interest in Romano's, why did you leave 3 months ago? Why abandon your investment just when the restaurant needed strong leadership most?" Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment before she regained her smooth professional demeanor. "I left because Marco was unwilling to implement the necessary changes to protect our investment. I hoped that facing the consequences of his poor decisions alone might motivate him to be more reasonable about accepting professional management." "So this is a pressure tactic," I said. "You left to force Dad into desperation, then returned with legal documents to establish control when he was most vulnerable." "That's a very cynical interpretation of a wife trying to save her husband's business," Victoria replied coolly. "Ex-wife," Dad said quietly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You're my ex-wife, Victoria. You divorced me, remember? Filed papers, divided assets, moved out. You don't get to play the concerned spouse when it's convenient for your business interests." Victoria's mask slipped completely for a second, revealing the cold calculation beneath. "Marriage is just a legal arrangement, Marco. Business partnerships transcend personal relationships. These documents establish my rights regardless of our romantic status." The front door chimed again, interrupting our increasingly tense conversation. I turned to see a distinguished older man in an expensive suit entering the restaurant, his silver hair perfectly styled and his briefcase suggesting official business. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I'm looking for Marco Romano. I'm Jonathan Mitchell from Mitchell Barnes & Associates. We spoke on the phone yesterday about a property matter." Dad looked confused. "I don't remember calling any lawyers." Victoria stepped forward smoothly. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for coming so promptly. As I explained yesterday, we need to clarify some ownership issues before making any changes to Romano's operational structure." My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. Victoria hadn't just brought documents to establish her legal claim on Romano's. She had brought her own lawyer to enforce those claims immediately, before Dad or I could mount any kind of legal challenge. "Actually," I said, pulling out my phone, Before we proceed with any legal discussions, I think we should verify some of these financial claims. Dad, do you mind if I call your accountant? I'd like to cross-reference these investment amounts with your actual business records. Victoria's face went white. That's completely unnecessary. These documents speak for themselves. I'm sure they do, I replied, already dialing the number I had found in Dad's business files. But in my experience, it's always wise to verify financial claims with independent records, especially when large sums of money are involved. The conversation with Dad's accountant was brief but illuminating. Yes, Romano's had undergone significant renovations and equipment upgrades. No, the amounts Victoria was claiming didn't match the actual expenses recorded in the business accounts. The discrepancies were substantial, in some cases double or triple the real costs. Moreover, several of the improvement projects Victoria was claiming credit for had actually been completed before she married Dad, funded through Romano's existing credit line rather than her personal investment. There seems to be some confusion about these financial records, I said, hanging up the phone and turning to face Victoria with growing confidence. According to Romano's accountant, several of these claimed investments either never happened or were significantly smaller than documented here. Victoria's lawyer looked uncomfortable, glancing between his client and the documents she had provided. Mrs. Romano, you assured me these financial claims were accurate and verifiable. They are accurate, Victoria insisted, but her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Perhaps the accountant's records are incomplete? Or perhaps, I said, my marketing training kicking in as I recognized a failing pitch, these documents have been altered to inflate your actual contributions to Romano's, which would make them fraudulent legal instruments. The word fraudulent hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode.
Victoria's lawyer took a step back, clearly reconsidering his involvement in whatever scheme his client had orchestrated. I think I need to review these documents more carefully before proceeding, Mr. Mitchell said diplomatically. Mrs. Romano, perhaps you could provide additional documentation to verify these investment claims. But Victoria's attention was no longer on her lawyer or her fabricated documents. She was staring at something behind me, her face a mask of shock and growing horror. I turned to follow her gaze and saw an elderly man standing in the restaurant's entrance, leaning heavily on a wooden cane, but radiating an authority that filled the entire room. He was impeccably dressed despite his obvious age, and there was something about his bearing that suggested power and success earned over decades. "Excuse me," he said, in accented English that carried the musical cadence of northern Italy. "I am looking for Marco Romano. I believe we have business to discuss." Dad stepped forward uncertainly. "I'm Marco Romano. Can I help you with something?" The old man smiled, and suddenly the whole room seemed brighter. "My name is Giuseppe Romano. I am your cousin from Milano. I believe it is time we talked about the family business." Dad stepped forward uncertainly. "I'm Marco Romano. Can I help you with something?" The old man smiled, and suddenly the whole room seemed brighter. "My name is Giuseppe Romano. I am your cousin from Milano. I believe it is time we talked about the family business." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to recognition to something approaching awe. "Giuseppe?" he whispered. "Cousin Giuseppe? But how did you—" "I have been watching Romano's for many years," Giuseppe said, moving slowly but purposefully into the dining room. "My father, your father's brother, he left Milano for America in 1952, but he never forgot the family that remained behind. When he died, he left instructions that I should keep watch over his American relatives." He gestured around the restaurant with obvious appreciation. "Your mother, Isabella, she wrote to me many times over the years. She sent photographs of Romano's, told me stories of the customers and the community you had built. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to her, I would ensure that Romano's remain in the Romano family." Victoria had gone completely silent, all her legal maneuvering suddenly irrelevant in the face of this unexpected development.
I came to America when I heard of the troubles, Giuseppe continued. The financial problems, the threats of closure, the confusion about ownership. It seemed that Romano's needed the guidance of family who understood what this restaurant really represents. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather folder, far more elegant than Victoria's portfolio, but somehow infinitely more significant. These are the papers that establish the Romano Family Trust, he said, placing the folder on the nearest table. A legal entity created 50 years ago to protect Romano family interests in America. Your father signed these documents in 1975, establishing Romano's Italian kitchen as a trust asset to be passed down through the family line. Dad stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. I don't understand. What does this mean? Giuseppe's smile was patient and kind. It means, cousin, that Romano's has never been solely your property to mortgage or partnership. It means that any legal claims on this restaurant must be approved by the trust administrators. And it means that the true owner of Romano's Italian kitchen is not Marco Romano the individual, but the Romano family legacy. He turned to look directly at me, his eyes twinkling with something that might have been pride. And according to these documents, the current heir apparent to the Romano family trust, the one designated to inherit full ownership of Romano's upon Marco's retirement, is his daughter, Sofia Romano. The words hit the room like thunder. Victoria's fabricated legal documents suddenly became meaningless scraps of paper. Her claims of partnership and investment were irrelevant against a family trust that had been established decades before she entered the picture. But more than that, Giuseppe's revelation meant that I hadn't just returned to help save Romano's. I had returned to claim my inheritance, to take possession of something that had always been meant to be mine. "Welcome back, owner," Dad said quietly, his voice thick with emotion and something that might have been relief. Victoria made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. Her lawyer was already packing up his briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from a client whose legal position had just evaporated completely. "This is impossible," Victoria whispered. "I've invested years of my life in this place. I've put everything I had into making Romano successful." "And we appreciate your contributions," Giuseppe said gently. "But contributions and ownership are different things. Romano's belongs to the Romano family, as it always has and always will." I looked around the restaurant that was apparently mine, seeing it with completely new eyes. The changes Victoria had made, the sterile efficiency she had imposed, could all be undone. The recipes Mom had perfected, the warmth and community she had fostered, the family legacy she had built, could all be restored. But more importantly, the relationship with Dad that had been broken by Victoria's manipulation could finally begin to heal. We were no longer estranged father and daughter arguing about a failed family business. We were partners in a legacy that stretched back generations, united by blood and purpose and the responsibility to honor what came before us. "So what happens now?" Dad asked, looking between Giuseppe and me with hope and uncertainty in equal measure. I picked up Victoria's fraudulent documents and walked to the nearest trash can, dropping them with a satisfying thud. "Now we rebuild Romano's the way it was meant to be. We bring back the recipes, the warmth, the sense of family that made this place special. We honor Mom's vision and Grandpa's legacy." I turned to face Victoria, who was standing frozen by the table where her legal dreams had just died. And we do it without the people who never understood what Romano's really represented. Victoria left without another word, her lawyer trailing behind her like an apologetic shadow. Through the front windows, I watched her get into her Mercedes and drive away, probably for the last time. Giuseppe settled into a chair with obvious satisfaction, his mission accomplished. "Now," he said, rubbing his hands together with enthusiasm, "let me tell you about the Romano recipes that have been lost over the years. I think it is time to bring them home." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.